Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Freethought Steve, the lone pleasurologist. But my topic today is beginning a series in anti-Christian education because Christianity is the anti-pleasurology worldview. An anti-pleasurology worldview regards pleasure in this world as suspect. Whereas pleasurological realism, my point of view, regards pleasure in this world as the best thing we can do, creating euphoric states of consciousness during our life in this world is probably the meaning of life. The meaning of life is to spend as much of our time in a euphoric state of consciousness as possible, and as little of our time in a dysphoric state of consciousness as possible. But many of us were raised in the Christian upbringing. We had a Christian upbringing imposed upon us without our consent. When we were too young to give our consent as little children, our parents began to program us with the Christian delusion. And my thesis today is that Christianity is a delusional worldview. It's also a sex-negative worldview and a hell-positive worldview, which is a terrible thing. And we had this programmed into us as we were growing up. And now as adults, in order to live a truly happy life and a truly pleasurological life, we need to lose our guilt about pleasure, especially sexual pleasure, and recognize that pleasure of all kinds, that's what life is about. That's what we should be aiming at. Pleasure not just for ourselves and our own consciousness, but pleasure for the other consciousnesses around us, the other people around us, and the animals around us. We should try and create euphoria in their consciousness when we have the opportunity to. And my other pleasurological programs are about how we can turn ourselves into the most pleasurable person that we can be, have the most pleasurable body, have the most pleasurable experiences, have the most pleasurable consciousness as possible. But today I'm going to focus on trying to liberate our culture, liberate ourselves individually and our culture in general from this delusional worldview called Christianity. Now, what do I mean by a delusional worldview? A delusion is when we take the imaginary to be real. And we believe in all these imaginary ideas. We believe that they're real, whereas in fact, they are purely imaginary. And all religions are made up of false truth claims. False truth claims based on the original intellectual sin, which is confusing imagination for reality. That's the basic intellectual sin that people make. And they make it for emotional reasons. They want to believe that the imaginary is real, and therefore they find ways to convince themselves that the imaginary is real, primarily by getting together with a lot of other delusionals who believe in the same set of imaginary ideas, and they will have an imaginary text, a text of imaginary ideas, which they worship. They turn it into an idol, they idolize it, and they say, this text is perfect, this text contains the absolute truth. Whereas in fact, the text is a collection of ancient traditions about the unknowable, false truth claims about the unknowable. What do I mean by the unknowable? And this is very, very basic and very important to any critique of religion. This is the idea we should start with in our critique of religion, which is that anything non-physical is unknowable. Anything non-physical is unknowable. And all religious beings, all spiritual beings, are defined as being non-physical. That's why we can't see them. We can't touch them. We can't hear them. And yet, these collections of ancient manuscripts make all kinds of false truth claims about the nature of non-physical beings. Now, non-physical beings are by definition imaginary. They're not based on any evidence, because evidence consists of what we can see, feel, touch, hear, smell, taste, etc., or what we can detect reliably with scientific instruments. And if we can detect something with our senses or with our scientific instruments, that something has a physical reality. And we should positively believe that, yes, our information about these real physical things is valid information. Any idea to be true rather than false has to be tested against the evidence of our senses or our scientific instruments. If the statement corresponds to reality, then the evidence of our senses and the evidence of our scientific instruments will support the statement. And we can say the statement is true. It has been verified. And there's a special name for this type of verification, finding out the truthfulness of a statement. We verify the statement by putting it to the test of comparing it with reality. And if the statement conforms to reality, the statement has been verified as true. And this is given a special name called empirical, empirical, empirical verification of any statement. All right. In order for the statement to be true, it's just a bunch of words. If somebody just says it, it's just a bunch of words. And if those words are to be true, they have to be tested against reality and be shown that they are in fact true. If we want to know whether a lake is 800 feet deep or 200 feet deep, we have to take some lead and drop it down on a string until it reaches the bottom, and then measure how much string has gone from the top to the bottom of the lake. And if it's 200 feet or 800 feet or 600 feet, it's reality that tells us how deep that lake is. We can't say that lake is 1,000 feet deep and make it 1,000 feet deep by saying it. We have to test the statement. We say the lake is 1,000 feet deep. Okay, that's what we call a hypothesis. That's a guess, a speculation about reality. And we test our hypothesis by measuring reality. Drop that line down and see how deep the lake actually is. No, the lake is only 600 feet deep. It's not 1,000 feet deep. Yes, but I said it was 1,000 feet deep. Yes, but the reality tells us that you were wrong. Your statement is wrong. The correct statement is the lake is 600 feet deep. And we should always modify our statements about reality according to what reality tells us. All right, so now what about religious statements? Religious statements are all about non-physical beings, supposed non-physical beings that human beings have imagined down through the ages. And you cannot measure or test a non-physical imaginary item of any sort. And so you can't say anything valid about a non-physical being, a so-called spiritual being. We cannot empirically verify any statement whatsoever about any kind of non-physical thing. You can't say, all right, so God would be the prototype non-physical thing. And here are some of the things that we cannot empirically verify. We cannot verify whether God or gods or any number of spirit beings actually exist, because we cannot measure them. We cannot perceive them. And our scientific instruments cannot possibly detect anything that's non-physical. If our scientific instruments can detect something, then it is physical. And then we can learn something about it. But that's not the case with any religious being like a god or goddess. So any statement about a god or goddess that anybody makes is a false truth claim. If they are claiming to know that God exists, that's a false truth claim. They cannot possibly produce any evidence that that is true. What will they produce as evidence for the idea that God exists? Well, we'll get to that in 1 second. You cannot say whether there is one God, many gods, or no gods at all. We have no way to test any of those statements. We can assert this. We can say, I feel absolutely certain that there are no gods at all. Or I feel absolutely certain that there are many gods. Or that there's one God. We can't test any of those assertions. Those are just verbal statements that people make. We can't test whether, if a God existed, it would be a benevolent God, a kind God, a loving God, or a mean and cruel God. Now, Christianity has a God who is totally schizophrenic. This God claims to be loving and benevolent. According to the Christians, they imagine their God as loving and benevolent, and therefore we should worship him. But on the other hand, this is a psychotic Hitler-type God who, according to the Christians, is going to send a lot of people to eternal torment in hell just because, he wants to. He's decided to. He's decided that they don't live up to his expectations. So those kinds of assertions are completely unprovable. That's exactly the kind of thing that we cannot possibly know about a non-physical being. We can't know if any non-physical beings exist or not. And when we have no evidence about something, there's only one thing that we should believe about. Whatever it is that we have no evidence about, the one thing we should believe about it is that we know absolutely nothing about it. That's the only true statement we can make about any non-physical being, is that we know absolutely nothing about it. It is impossible for us to know anything about it. And that holds true not just for whether that's a kind being or a non-kind being, whether it's male or female, whether there's one or many of them, but any statement whatsoever about any non-physical being, the only thing we should believe about non-physical beings is that we know nothing about them. So anyone who claims to know absolutely anything about non-physical beings is making a false truth claim. They're claiming to know something to be true without any evidence, no actual evidence whatsoever. So it's a false truth claim. Now they're going to claim that they've got a book of ancient manuscripts, a collection of ancient manuscripts written by people who all believed that they did know about the unknowable. But in point of fact, those people, thousands of years ago, were in exactly the same position we are in, only worse. They knew even less than we know about the real world, and they knew exactly what we know about the imaginary world, which is nothing. We know nothing about the imaginary world. They knew nothing about the imaginary world. but they imagined that they knew all about it. And so they put their imaginary truth claims down on paper and copied them over, and people began to believe them. And people today still believe that these imaginary speculations about the completely unknowable are true, simply because people have believed them to be true for thousands of years. It's as though they believe that something imaginary becomes real if it's old enough, and if enough people have believed it for long enough. And that's not the case. Human beings are completely capable of believing that the imaginary is true. That's one of the real things that we know about human consciousness, is that human beings are absolutely, really capable of believing that imaginary things are true. And that, as I said, is the original intellectual sin. Being mistaken in thinking that the imaginary is real. But people have been doing it for so long, and people have grown up surrounded by other people who all believe that the imaginary is real. And unfortunately, the way the human psyche is made, when we grow up, we tend to believe the same things that other people believe around us. And that's the way that the human brain is made. And so unfortunately, when we are surrounded by people who all believe that the imaginary is real, then we will believe it too. And of course, they all believe, each group believes a specific version of imaginary ideas about the unknowable. There are many different Christian groups who all believe a slightly different version of the unknowable, an imaginary version that is slightly different from the imaginary version of this other Christian church group. But then you have the Muslims who believe a substantially different version of the imaginary. And then you have the Hindus, they believe something different. And all the different religions of the world believe different versions of the imaginary. And all of those versions are false truth claims. Every single one of those versions of the imaginary is made up of false truth claims. Now, they will tell us that long ago, God spoke to certain individuals. The unknown spoke to certain individuals. The creator of the multiverse spoke to certain individuals. All right? We live in a universe of 400 billion galaxies. Each galaxy has hundreds of billions of stars. And there are 400 billion galaxies. And a billion is 1,000 times a million. So we live in this huge, huge universe, and there are probably other universes surrounding it. And we probably live in a multiverse. And so the people who claim that they've got this book that tells them about the mind of the multiverse are deeply deluded. They believe that certain individuals long ago received a message from the mind of the multiverse, and we have no proof that the multiverse has a mind, has a consciousness, has an intelligence. There's no proof of that. We have no way of knowing that. And we have no way of knowing exactly how our universe came into being 13.7 billion years ago, because none of us was there to see it. And so we can only guess about that, but we can never know for sure. We can have certain scientific guesses about it based on certain kinds of evidence. There's cosmic radiation out there that makes us think that there was, in fact, a Big Bang, 13.7 billion years ago. But we can't prove that's true. None of us was there. We can't know that. There are limits to human knowledge. And that's what religious people refuse to recognize, is that human knowledge is limited. Our real valid knowledge is limited to what we can observe around us in reality. And we have to accept those limits. We have to accept that we are not going to be able to answer all the questions that we have. We have a lot more questions than we can ever answer. And particularly when those questions involve imaginary, non-physical beings, we have no way to answer that. And we shouldn't try to, because anytime you claim to know anything about the non-physical, you are deviating from the truth. That is a lie, to claim that you know something about the unknowable. The only truth about the unknowable that there is that we do not know it. That's the only truth about the unknowable. We do not know it. Any statement that you make about the unknowable, if you claim that statement to be true, that's a deviation from the truth. We can only speculate about the unknowable. So, the intelligent person, a person like Voltaire, for instance, says, all I need to know in life, I can know. And I accept what I do know, and I don't pretend to know what I don't know. And if everybody would just stop pretending to know what they don't know and limit themselves to what they actually do know, we would have a lot less trouble in the world. Because, of course, when you've got two different groups, like Christians and Muslims, who believe in different, significantly different versions of the unknowable, neither one of them can use science and the observation of reality to prove that their version of the unknowable is true and the other version is false, and thereby convince the other side with evidence that their version of the unknowable is false. Since none of us can know anything about the unknowable, nobody can prove anything about the unknowable, well, how are these people going to solve their differences? They've just got to fight each other and kill each other. And whoever is able to kill more of the other side, they end up claiming, okay, we were right. You know, our version of the unknowable is right because we were able to kill more of the other side than they were of us. But killing other human beings is not a way of proving the truth about anything, except, you know, who's the meaner people and who has the better weapons. That doesn't prove anything about the truth concerning the unknowable. Nothing can ever prove anything about the truth concerning the unknowable. We have to accept the limits of our knowledge and not pretend, not get above ourselves and pretend that we know stuff that we don't know. And what's worse, once we have convinced ourselves that we know stuff that we don't really know, we use those beliefs to persecute other people if they don't agree with us. How crazy is it to say, you must agree with what I believe about the unknowable, because what you believe about the unknowable is wrong. And people do this all the time, and it's utterly crazy to claim that their imaginary version of what cannot be known is true, and somebody else's imaginary version of what cannot be known is false. It's utterly crazy. So that's why when it comes to theology, what's theology? Theology is just speculation about so-called gods, spirit beings. So all theology is nothing but imagination. And it's absolutely crazy to go around using theology to try and coerce other people into behaving like in ways they don't want to. For instance, particularly in sexuality. People will use their sacred text, their ancient sacred text, to make them say, well, God hates people who are attracted to members of their own sex. Same-sex attractions, God hates that because my sacred text tells me that. All right, well, their sacred text, where did that come from? It's from these people who've been dead for thousands of years who imagined that the mind of the multiverse was talking to them and telling them this. All right. Now, Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, the book that helped launch the American Revolution, Thomas Paine wrote about religion as well. And he said, revelation, when somebody claims they've had a revelation from God, revelation is nothing but hearsay. You say God spoke to you, and this is what you tell me he told you. But I didn't witness him speaking to you. I didn't hear him speaking to you. I'm having to take your word that this is what God said. And that's what a prophet is. All the Old Testament books, there are the books of the prophets. They start out by saying, this is an oracle of Yahweh. Yahweh was the Jewish God. I like to call him Yahoo. Nobody knows how that 4 letters, YHWH, was actually pronounced. So Yahoo is one of the possible pronunciations. This is an oracle of Yahoo. An oracle of Yahoo. An oracle means something right out of the mouth of Yahoo. And then they reel off all this stuff that they believe Yahoo told them. Do we doubt that they believe that Yahoo told them that? I don't doubt it, no. I think they were totally sincere in believing that they heard the voice of Yahoo speaking to them. Because human beings hear voices all the time. We have a voice in our head that's always talking to us. When we dream at night, we hear the voices of the people in our dreams. So it's very easy for someone who wants to believe that they can hear the mind of the multiverse talking to them via the god Yahoo. They call the mind of the multiverse Yahoo, and Yahoo is speaking to them. They can believe that, and they can speak it out. And then when they speak it out, somebody can write it down, taking dictation, and write it all down. And there you've got this oracle of Yahoo. And this is maybe 600 BC, 700 BC. And it gets part of this collection of ancient texts. And people say, yeah, this is what Yahoo said. And it's not what Yahoo said. It's what some individual imagined Yahoo might say to them. This is hearsay. A realistic explanation of all revelation is that it's one individual working within a cultural tradition of beliefs about the unknowable. All right, they've already got a religious cultural tradition made up of unprovable beliefs about the unknowable. And so within that tradition, they are imagining what Yahoo might say to them. And then somebody's writing it down in this book. And then 2,700 years later, people are worshiping this book. They have made a god out of this book. They are bibliolaters. They are engaged in bibliolatry. They are idolaters. They're worshiping the Bible as though it were an idol, as though it were a perfect thing. And the Bible rules their lives, and they are trapped by their worship of this ancient collection of false truth claims about the unknowable. And as long as they are trapped in this belief that the only source of knowledge about the unknowable is this collection of ancient imaginings, their actual behavior in the world today is going to be dictated by that book, because they place that book above themselves and they submit their lives to that book, and they live their lives according to that book of ancient imaginings about the unknowable. And the only way to break free from this kind of thinking is to simply refuse to believe that the imaginary is real. Now, maybe Yahweh did speak to these ancient prophets. How do we know that he didn't single out, that Yahweh didn't single out one human being to talk to? Well, in my opinion, the mind of the multiverse, if there is such a thing, if the multiverse has a mind, and if it was capable of creating the multiverse, then there's no reason at all that if it wanted to speak to human beings, it couldn't speak to all human beings at the same time. And we would all hear the mind of the multiverse talking to us at the same time. And that would be impressive. If all of us heard in our own minds, without wanting to, all of a sudden we heard, like the principal of the high school, comes on over the intercom in the morning, and he's sitting in the main office, and he's speaking to all the classrooms across campus over the intercom system, and everybody sitting in homeroom at the beginning of the day hears the principal saying what the schedule for the day is, what special events are, and so forth. So the mind of the multiverse could talk to all of us, and say, hey there, human beings, this is a multiverse. You're all hearing this at once, and what I want you to do is the following. I want you to be nice to each other. I want you to be kind to each other. I want you to love each other. I want you to enjoy your life as much as possible without hurting other people. All right, you got that? Okay, I'll be back tomorrow to repeat it, just in case you forgot. And the multiverse could talk to us every day, talk to all of us every day. That would be an impressive revelation, okay? Now, of course, we couldn't prove that it wasn't some aliens with advanced technology who have learned how to telepathically spam us so that we would all hear the same thing. So we couldn't really even trust that. And if we got a message that said, I want you to be cruel to each other, I want you to fight each other, I want to see who's the strongest here, who can outlast the others, and so go ahead and start killing each other and let's see who's left. And if you got that message, that might be the aliens, trying to clear the population off the planet so they could come and occupy it. But what we would have to say, if we got such a message, is, wait a minute, mind of the universe, mind of the multiverse, I'm sorry that's what you want us to do, but we're not going to do it, because that would just make us unhappy. And we're not going to make ourselves unhappy just because you've got this crazy idea that that's what we should do. Any message, any revelation that we would ever get from anywhere, we would always have to judge that with our own sense of what's right and wrong, with our own intelligence, with our own conscience. We should never rely on something that is supposed to be a revelation if it's going to make us do something immoral. You must sacrifice your firstborn child to me, because otherwise I'll be angry at you. This is the way the Mayans used to believe, the Aztecs. Lots of people believed in human sacrifice because they imagined that was the way to keep the spirit beings happy. And so they would actually kill their children in order to keep the spirit beings happy, because they believed that their priests had gotten that revelation from the spirit beings. People can all the time imagine that they're having revelations and really truly believe it. An example of that, and I'll just finish up with that for today, an example of that occurred just a week or so ago. It was actually about 6 months ago, I think, that this South African guy named Joshua Malekela had a vision of Jesus. He said he came on an internet program, and said, Jesus Christ stood before me physically, and I saw him, and he gave me this message. He said, God has chosen you as the last arrow in his quiver, the quiver of truth that God is going to be sending to humanity. This is our last chance to get it right. The end of the world is coming on September 23rd and 24th of 2025. And this is an absolute final message. This is when the world is going to end. I, Jesus, am going to come, make my second coming and judge the world and all of this stuff. And he came on this internet program and he said, this is absolutely true. I saw Jesus, and this is what he told me. These words that are coming from my mouth, these are the words of God that are coming from my mouth. And no one has been able to refute me on this. This is final. This is ultimate. And, was he just a con man, looking to get attention? Or was he sincere? And is that what Jesus told him? Did he have a vision of Jesus? I think it is quite possible he had a vision of Jesus. People are capable of having hallucinations. Our consciousness, our brain, can create a picture of something that appears to be really there, that is not really there. Our brain creates all of our sensations, usually based on the sensations we get from the outside world. But of course, at night, our brain creates dreams, and it creates things that appear to be very, very real to us. And those are creations of our brain. So are the sensations that we actually experience in our daily life. You're not actually looking at me. You're looking at a picture of me, not just on a screen, but a reproduction of that screen, which has been forwarded from your eyes to your brain, and your brain has created that reproduction in consciousness. So you are looking at a reproduction of me in your consciousness that has been created by your brain. It's not a direct picture from your eyes. The eyes have sent digital signals from your eyes to your brain. The brain has used those digital signals and processed them to create what appears to be an absolutely real image of me in front of you. But that's just something, all of these experiences that we have are created by our brain using sensations and using our imagination. And under extraordinary situations, the brain can produce what looks like a real sensation, a real physical sensation. It looks absolutely real under certain extraordinary conditions in the brain. But it is just a creation of the brain itself. And it's in consciousness, and it appears to be real. So that's what I think Joshua Malekela experienced. Was he experienced a true hallucination of Jesus Christ because he really believed in that, and he wanted to believe in that, and his brain gave him what he wanted to believe. And Jesus told him that the world was going to come to an end September 23rd to 24th, 2025, which was like a week and a half ago. And a lot of people were surprised when it didn't happen, but of course most of us were not surprised. But what can we conclude from this? If this was an example of someone who truly believed he had a revelation, and it didn't happen. Now there are two possibilities. The first one is the possibility that I just suggested, that he hallucinated Jesus, and Jesus gave him this message. But of course it was his own imagination that was giving him that message. The second possibility is that Jesus appeared to him and decided to prank the whole human race by pretending that he was going to come on the 23rd and 24th, but he was just fooling us all. Okay? That's the other possibility. But I think the realistic possibility is simply that, like all revelations, all so-called religious revelations down through history, this was a hallucination produced by the mind of someone who believed so strongly that the imaginary is real that his brain created a portion of the imaginary and made it look as though it were an actual sensation, a real sensation. This is something the brain is completely capable of doing. So, when they worship a book, when they worship a collection of ancient manuscripts that have been written down by people we don't even know who these people were, for the most part, we don't know who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, which are supposedly the laws of Moses. We don't know that those were written by priests who lived 1,000 years maybe after Moses himself would have lived, if Moses ever even existed. So the priests who wrote down the laws of Moses were writing down things that they imagined Yahweh might have said to Moses. And so if today you take this book of ancient imaginings about the unknowable and you say, I'm going to live my life according to this book, you're not doing the commands of God, because the mind of God is unknowable to us. What you're doing is you're letting the imaginations of people who died thousands of years ago rule your life. And some people do that. Why do they do that? Well, they do it because there's a false promise that they're going to go to heaven when they die. And tomorrow I'll talk about what does happen when we die, which is absolutely nothing for absolutely no time at all. None of us is ever going to experience being dead for not even a second. None of us is going to experience being dead. It's impossible to. Our consciousness dissolves the moment that our brain shuts down. And in fact, our consciousness dissolves every night when we go through dreamless sleep. When we fall asleep, we go through a period of dreamless sleep before we start dreaming. And that period of dreamless sleep, our consciousness has dissolved completely. And we're not there. But we don't remember it because there's no experience to remember when consciousness has dissolved. And so that's exactly what being dead forever is like. The same absolute non-experience for no length of time that we experience every night when we die, or when we go to sleep. When we go through dreamless sleep, we temporarily die. And then we come back to life. And we don't remember being dead because you can't remember anything when you have no consciousness. And you cannot be aware of the passage of time when you have no consciousness. You can't be aware that you're not there. You don't remember anything before that. When we die, we're not going to remember anything that happened during our life, but we won't regret that, because you would have to have a consciousness in order to regret anything. And we won't know that we're not there. We won't know that we don't have a consciousness, because you would have to have a consciousness in order to know that you didn't have one. And that's impossible. As soon as we don't have a consciousness, we don't know that we don't have a consciousness. So this whole idea that people will follow the Bible so they hope they can live forever when they die, or that they can avoid going to hell forever when they die, both of those are completely imaginary rewards and punishments. And yet people will live their whole lives according to the rules of an ancient book in hopes of getting this imaginary reward after they're actually dead, instead of living their lives while they're alive to enjoy their lives as much as possible, which is what humanistic realism says. Humanistic realism says, let's enjoy life. let's try and make life as good as it can possibly be, not just for ourselves, but for the other folks around us. And that's what will make life worth living as we live it. And we don't need to worry about when we're dead. It's all going to be the same for all of us. No matter how much money we've ever made or how many great experiences we've had during our life, it's all going to be exactly the same when we die. All of us are going to experience exactly the same thing, nothing at all, for no time at all. And there's nothing anyone can do to change that, because it is the brain, the living human brain, that produces our consciousness. And when the brain shuts down, as it does when we get an anesthetic, when we have an operation, or when we go through dreamless sleep, or when we die, when the brain shuts down, consciousness simply evaporates. It's just not being produced. You have to have a living brain to produce consciousness. Okay, so that's reality. And knowing that reality, we can free ourselves from having to let our lives be governed by the imaginings of people who've been dead for thousands of years. Okay, thanks for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.